everybody. Good morning. We have a great panel today. James Hoffman to my right, Vice President of External and Customer Affairs for Alabama Fiber, Ben Sanborn, Conterra Networks, and Ariane Schaefer, Head of Public Policy and Government Affairs at G-Fiber. So the topic of the panel is modernizing permitting and infrastructure rules to streamline broadband deployment. So I thought what we would do is start with some of the challenges your companies face in terms of permitting and broadband deployment. I'll start, James, with you.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you for moderating the panel, and to my fellow panelists, good to be here. I won't make the assumption that you all know what Alabama Fiber Network is, because we're brand new. We are by Alabama for Alabama. We're founded by 8 electric cooperatives with the support of Alabama Power, the governor, the Alabama legislature, and last but not least, the American Rescue Plan. And we have an ambitious, 2 ambitious goals: build a 400 gigabit state-of-the-art fiber highway system that any county can tap into, 62 shelters along that network for last mile providers to plug into, think BEAD, and then to serve over 550 community anchor institutions, hospitals, fire departments, local government. And the best news about all this is that we are ahead of schedule and on budget. That being said, there are things like franchise agreements and particular provisions that slow us down a bit, or at least slow negotiations down. We have a conservative operating budget. Don't confuse grant funds with operating budget. Grant funds are for putting fiber in the ground. So when folks come to us and make large requests around one-time cash payments or percentage of revenue, those things slow us down. We have not had to coil up our fiber at the edge of somebody's right-of-way, but we think about that and we worry about that. And that is just a light touch on that question.
Thanks. I'm Ben Sanborn with Conterra Networks. We operate in a number of states. We're headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. We do a significant amount of work in Texas and Louisiana. We have mostly, we started out as an E-rate company, so we have a lot of education customers, but we have been transitioning to enterprise services as well. We don't serve residential customers, but we are focused on getting our network densified in a number of markets, and we can work with those providers who are doing end user service, acting as a middle mile agent, and we do backhaul for towers and for wireless companies, et cetera. And when we're trying to deploy our facilities, the issues that we have with permitting tend to fall into 3 categories. One is with the communities who may not have ever done a franchise agreement before. Like I said, we go into a lot of education locations with E-rate, and frequently that means they're very rural. And so we may be going through very small communities, and we have had the question of, okay, we'd love to have you here. Now what? What do we do? How do we make sure that we're protecting our right of way at the same time we're making it possible for you to serve our schools? And then the other issue we have is some federal properties. We've had some issues where we're getting onto military bases, and they're frequently large bases that have a lot of other types of businesses located on their property, and we have to get 13 different signatures whenever we're trying to do some sort of work on that property, which can be time consuming and can impact our ability to get onto these locations. And then railroads, which are just today, there was a new issue that came up in Texas with us, where we're trying to cross a right of way. It's a public right of way. It's owned by the city. And we're being told, if you don't pay us more money, we're going to have our people arresting your workers. And so we are stuck in a situation where we are trying to figure out how do we make all of these projects move forward in a way that works for everybody. Because I think at the end of the day, what we need to remember is this is not a zero-sum game. This is not, in order for us to win, somebody else has to lose. And we especially feel this is true with the smaller communities we're going into. How do we make sure that we can get these permitting and franchise agreements done quickly and effectively that give them the protection they need while allowing us to move rapidly to deploy to our customers?
Incredibly well said. Thank you, Ben. Hey, folks, my name is Ariane Schaefer. I'm with G-Fiber. I head policy. G-Fiber is Google and Alphabet's fiber to the home deployment. We operate in 20 states across the US and have certainly seen our share of permitting delays and issues. I'm going to try to keep the energy up. I know we're getting close to lunch, which is really exciting. And rather than frame it from the, some of the challenges we're dealing with, I'm going to go with some things we'd love to see, and then you can assume the challenge that I will be saying. So one will be, we would love a single point of contact when we're working with communities. Ben alluded to when there are so many either different agencies or groups or parts of the municipality that need to sign off. We totally understand. We want to make sure everyone is informed and up to date. We just ask that we have a single point of contact. All right. Second, transparency. For us, we find it really important when we're going through, again, all of the different agencies and different rules, things that we might need to do ahead of a deployment. If we just had a list up front of the things that needed to be done ahead of our deployment, we would then be able to prioritize based on needs from the community and deploy them with a timeline that we can both agree to and deploy at that timeline. And finally, again, I said I would come up with the solution. So we would love a community software solution for permits to be submitted, go through the process, approved. Yes, we still submit some of our permits via fax. I will stop there.
Thanks, Ariane. So, I think we heard a lot this morning that there's a lot of interest on Capitol Hill and at the FCC in doing something about at least as much as can be done at the federal level in terms of making it easier to get through the permitting process and reduce some of these barriers that you face when you're dealing with the permitting for broadband deployment, especially with BEAD coming and BEAD coming to a lot of communities that don't have the infrastructure set up to handle the flood of permits that they're going to see. And so we wanted to talk briefly about some of the proposals that have been discussed and introduced on Capitol Hill, some that are floating around the halls at the FCC. One of those that we've discussed before is, in 2017 and 18, the FCC adopted a set of proposals and rules regarding small cell deployment and limiting local government restrictions on small cell deployment. And I'm just wondering what the panel thinks about grafting those types of regulations to help streamline broadband deployment. Ariane, you want to kick that off?
Yeah, sure. We think about these pros and cons, certainly. We've seen the rollout for the wireless rules, from a handful of years ago now. And what would it mean to include fiber or, connectivity beyond just wireless? I'll start with the pros, right? You have a timeline that everyone's agreed to, that the private sector is able to build on that timeline. Unfortunately, the con is if the community isn't approving those permits in that timeline already, there's usually a reason why. They're not just sitting on it for no reason. They're potentially could be understaffed or under-resourced. And so as we're thinking about what potential rulemaking or legislation should look like, how do we support the problem rather than just putting more rules on someone who may or may not be able to even comply? And then you're looking at fines and recourse after that, which, when you're trying to essentially enter into a marriage with a community, you're putting in millions of dollars of assets. It's not great when you start off that rocky. But Ben, you had some great comments on that.
Yeah, I think that the key here, what we're trying to do is we're not trying to regulate, we're trying to facilitate. That really the goal of what's happening at the federal level, whether it's legislation or whether it's the FCC, is to find a way to facilitate the implementation of the broadband programs in a way that is beneficial to the community. And as Mr. Poole said on an earlier panel, we have these relationships with communities that we don't want to lose, that we don't want to sour. And how do we do this in a way that is going to be beneficial? And I think that shot clocks are good, but to Ariane's point, if it's a community that just plain doesn't have more than 5 people working in their permitting division, and now all of a sudden all this BEAD money is coming through and they have 50 permits that people are trying to get through their small town, then how do we address the shot clock? And that's where it might be useful to try and find sort of best practices guidelines to say, okay, if you're new to this and if we're trying to figure out how to make this happen, let's figure out what are some baseline engineering requirements for what's going to go in your right of way. Let's figure out what some baseline requirements are for how you're going to approve permits or have repayment compensation if it's a percentage of revenues, et cetera, and make that applicable to everybody instead of trying to do a one-by-one approach for each person coming in or for each company coming in. Maybe make a most favored nation process. I started out 25 years ago in telecom, so the interconnection agreements were required to be adopted by a new CLEC. When a new CLEC came in, they were able to say, I don't want to have to negotiate a brand new interconnection agreement. I just want to use this one that already exists. Maybe we do something like that with franchises to say, if you agree that you're just going to do everything that's in that franchise today, you can have it. You can have it right now. And things like that can help to facilitate the process in a way that will improve the speed to deployment, which is our real issue.
So I will add, my response will be 2 parts. I think this is where I can nod to the ingenuity in Alabama and the forethought that the governor and the legislature took in 2019 to pass HB 400, which allows our fiber to run in power easements across the state, power easements of our owners, Alabama Power and partners. That was huge. Alabama is very well positioned in that regard, and we're delivering on the promises that we've made. Now, in my experience, my introduction to telecom was to pass some of Virginia's small cell legislation when I was a contract lobbyist back in the day. And then Verizon invited me to move downstream from that work, and help them get franchise agreements for millimeter wave across Virginia, places like Virginia Beach. So I have been at the front lines and been in those conversations with those permitting folks and feel like I have an understanding of the legislative backbone. One thing I will offer is, and Verizon being a great company and being a very thoughtful company, was wise to think hard about when the deemed approved, for instance, trigger was pulled, because that, for instance, is the nuclear option. And it's cause for reflection, because anything that anybody's going to be able to do quickly and efficiently in a locality is going to be born on the back of the relationships and the trust that you've built, in my opinion, based on the conversations I've had throughout my career. It's a tool, but it should be used wisely. That being said, we are very well prepared in Alabama with HB 400 and continuing on down the road of putting about 6,600 miles of fiber either in the ground or in service.
Thank you. Ben, I think we touched upon this briefly in your opening remarks. And one of the pieces of legislation that is circulating is a bill to put some guardrails around the process regarding building telecom infrastructure across, around, under railroad right-of-way. Again, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that bill, what it accomplishes, what it might not accomplish, and particularly the benefits and risks associated with that. And then we'll let the other panelists chime in.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, with the railroad legislation, what it's really designed to do is to say if you've got the right-of-way approval from either the city or the DOT for both sides of a railroad crossing, it's in crossing the public right-of-way, then you essentially can move forward with doing your underground boring work or your crossing of the right-of-way, and there would be a set dollar figure for what you'd be compensating the railroads to do this. And there would be timelines for when the railroads would be able to review it and say, we might have a concern about the engineering that's going into this. And this is not a brand new concept. There are a number of states that have done that. The most recent is Virginia. that put in legislation that is substantially similar to what is being considered in the federal realm here. And that's been working really well. The railroads have been suing the state and the Public Utilities Commission in Virginia to try and reverse the legislation, but it has been allowed to proceed while those suits are ongoing. And in 2024, it seemed to work really well. And so that's what we're hoping to gain out of this, is to really say, we're not trying to do anything that is going to endanger the railroads. We're willing to look at what are their engineering standards to make sure that anything we put in meets those engineering standards. We're also not looking to do a takings. We're saying, yes, there is compensation that is going to go to the railroads, absolutely. And if you can show that there should be more than what the standard compensation is, that's fine. But let's make sure that we have that fight after the facilities have been deployed, because at the end of the day, if you're talking about what the takings dollar amount is, that's something that can be resolved at any point. That's something that can be resolved easily once the facilities are deployed. And so let's not use that as a way to slow down the deployment of broadband. So I think it has a real opportunity to speed this along in a way. Again, this is not a zero-sum game. We're not trying to make us the winners and railroads losers. We're trying to do this in a way that makes sure that the railroads have their engineering safety concerns met, that they are not suffering a taking, and yet we're able to quickly deploy our services to the benefit of the community.
Echoing Ben again. Yes. So this legislation, we've been working really closely, thanks to the NCOMPAS team, on both the House and the Senate side on what this could mean moving forward. This is a huge roadblock, a barrier to deploying broadband to a ton of communities. You know, when you say the community on the other side of the tracks, like this is truly, we cannot get to the community on the other side of the tracks because of this. And I would say most providers, if not all, have communities they could list you off the top of their head that they cannot get to because of enormous onerous fees or requirements, or honestly, they've been waiting up to 18 months for an approval. It's just absolutely wild. And a unnamed state and an unnamed railroad in the Midwest, we just had $40,000 ask to cross. One of the big things I want to highlight that Ben said is he used set dollar figure. You might not realize, but these usually railroads are asking for annual amounts, right? So we're trying to ask for single upfront amounts of money so that it's all agreed upon and rates don't increase over time. And again, we are fully compensating folks, but we need to build out our networks. We need to model that. We need to model the cost effectively and the timelines to the communities. It's very frustrating when there's a community on the other side of the tracks asking us, why are you not here? Why are you not serving us? We want your service. I think we'd all have examples of that. And it's tough when you have to explain why you're not there. So we've been really privileged to work with the NCOMPAS team. We have some great allies up on Capitol Hill right now. Deb Fisher out of Nebraska. When she was state senator, Deb Fisher actually passed legislation along the same lines as in Virginia, and it's been going really well. What was really positive, I will say I was not in the room in Nebraska at the time, but for the folks that were, they say it was all parties really came to the table understanding, both on the railroad side and the broadband side, this was a huge issue and one that needed to be addressed. So we really also think that the Nebraska legislation is a really good North Star to get to, where both railroads and the deployers were able to come to a compromise.
So Alabama Fiber Network supports this legislation, even considering, of course, we have the benefits of bills like HB 400. We are putting a fair amount of our own fiber in the ground in the right of way. But in addition to that, remember I mentioned that over 3,000-mile highway system of fiber that's 90% done. Last mile providers are finding us on the map. Where is Alabama Fiber Network? Because who are they going to plug into to go serve residential customers? They're going to plug into our network. So we are very sensitive to the obstacles that are shared by those we care about.
Thank you, James. We heard this morning from Senator Moran about an issue that I think I know is near and dear to all three of you, and that is the Broadband Tax Treatment Act. If you want to talk about that briefly on
Sure.
the impact on your companies and the impact on your ability to deploy that capital to better serve the customers that you're trying to reach?
Most significant public policy issue we have ever faced, full stop. We are grateful for north of $260 million of grant funding. That means we have a $45 million tax bill that will hamper what we are able to do, we think, and that certainly would make it a challenge to operate this great network. And it's, to date, in that way, a shame, because we are, again, ahead of schedule and on budget. We are doing what we were asked to do and doing it very well. So we are very grateful to the senators. I saw the House bill dropped, and we're certainly going to be talking about that this week, because it's important to Alabama Fiber Network, and it's important to Alabamians from north to south that we're able to use every dollar that we were granted to build. Because that's, when we look at these over 550 community anchor institutions, these fire departments, these hospitals that are in areas where they're losing payers, our funding was drawn up to get to the dots. And when you're talking about, 17% of that funding would be a tax bill. Well, that's a problem.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that the real concern is that the dollars are finite, and it is very hard to justify taking money that was raised through taxes initially and then giving it to providers to get taxed again. That it just sort of seems like it's fairly, from our perspective, it's common sense that if you're going to be using taxpayer dollars to support a specific program, you shouldn't tax it again.
Ariane?
Truly nothing more could be said on this topic.
Okay. So there's also, legislation that is more directly addressed at streamlining permitting and broadband deployment that has been introduced that would somewhat mirror and extend what was done in 2017 and 18 at the FCC and adopt that into legislation. And Ariane, I know that was something that you wanted to talk about in terms of the pros and cons of taking that concept and moving it into federal legislation.
One thing Ben said that I'm really resonating with is we are not trying to regulate, but facilitate. Truly, as companies and as a part of this country, we are trying to connect every single household, every family, and every community to broadband. And what are the different pain points that we're identifying on the municipal side, the community side, or the private side, or the deployer side? And how do we come together and address the problem and the solution? I went over some of the pros and cons, I think, earlier for on the wireless side, what it would mean for communities. One plug I want to share. Last year, a bunch of folks from the industry, both public sector, private sector, local government, state government, federal government, and everyone in between came together. We sat in a room at Georgetown Law and said, we have a permitting problem. We need a solution. Local governments were feeling a lot of pressure from industry. Industry was feeling like local government wasn't up to the task. So how do we address this, right? How do we facilitate, not regulate? For those interested, we came up with 60 pages of a solution. Everything in here was agreed upon by all parties, right? How are there different models? Rather than maybe regulating, what are some of the ways that we can be supporting each other? From industry, we don't do everything perfectly. I think that was a really big part of the conversation when we showed up to the table, is acknowledging that we can be doing things better as well in this permitting situation. One is not pulling permits for areas you don't need. Seems pretty straightforward, but when your boss is asking you, when are we deploying there? When, you might want to get ahead and start permitting. But if the construction doesn't line up and you're not actually going to be building there anytime soon, why don't we give some of our municipal friends reprieve and not pull permits for processing at that time? So I know I'm going back to some of those pros and cons, but I think legislation could be helpful if the local governments are supportive and if we can find ways to continue to advance their efforts and resources, whether that's through software that could be either licensed or given for free, or additional resources for permitting capacity. One of the examples, there's 4 case studies in here, is interestingly, the city of Mesa allows for private sector to contribute to permitting resources. It's a separate fund. It's non-biased based on the company that's contributing, but it allows for a temporary increase in permitting application approval. So there's 4 different case studies of different communities prioritizing and making sure that permits get approved rapidly so that we can be deploying and it's not that bottleneck.
Ben?
I agree. I think that it's something that it can be helpful. We've got to do it in a way that is working with the communities that we're going through, recognizing some of the issues that they may have, but by making clear delineations of here's some sort of baseline expectations that might help to focus the conversations that we may have with communities to say, these are the things that need to be part of an agreement. We'd like to get these in place so that we can move within these timelines. And then you can have the discussion with the community of, okay, if you can't make this timeline, why? And so I think it's important that it not be so rigid that it not allow for some availability of communities to say, here's why we can't make it. But at the same time, if you create this expectation where the expectation is you're going to meet these principles. And if you can't, then you can have the discussion with the community as opposed to a structure where there might not be the expectations up front. And so you have a harder time really narrowing the focus as to what needs to happen in order to make this go forward in a timely manner. I think that's where it has the best benefit, is sort of focusing the conversation.
These folks are good. I can't add much to that. Though I will say, just a quick note on the taxability of grant funds. We also recognize that the return and full up of bonus depreciation and retroactivity back to January 2025 is also another thing that could help with this significant tax bill and help a lot of companies across the country do a great number of things. So a quick nod there.
And I think that that the other piece of legislation that we talked about, which I think is somewhat similar, which is the amendment to the Middle Class Tax Relief Act from 2012, which had a significant impact on wireless deployments, particular co-location of wireless equipment on existing structures. Ariane, I know that was something you had some notes about, you wanted to talk about.
I don't think it was.
No?
I think one of my panelists are way more educated on this issue than I am.
I don't know that that's me. I think that, from our perspective, our biggest issues at this point, because we mostly do underground boring, so our biggest issues at this point have to do with delays and in permitting and that issue. And so that's what most of our focus on. Like with railroads, there's excessive costs and those are problematic, but that's actually not the biggest thing. The biggest thing is that if we can't get someplace because we're having a 6-month delay because we can't find a proper crossing spot, then we lose a customer. And that means that customer loses the opportunity of competition in their area. And so that's one of those things where the costs matter, but the timing matters more to us.
Well, I thank you all for your time. I think